Good evening and welcome to the annual Reverend Charles Von Yu Lecture at St. John's Seminary. My name is Paul Matilli and I serve as the academic dean here. Before I introduce our esteemed lecturer, our very own Dr. Angela Franks, let us begin by invoking together the intercession of our Blessed Lady with a Hail Mary. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners, now and at the hour of our death.
Amen. St. John the Evangelist,
Pray for us.
Dr. Angela Franks has been a member of the faculty at St. John's for more than 16 years. That's often a fifth or even a quarter of one's entire life. She has recently accepted a teaching and research position for the next academic year at the Catholic University of America. And so it is fitting at taking this opportunity as an assembled community to recall and celebrate with gratitude and praise the good that Dr. Franks has bestowed on the seminary and the Theological Institute during her tenure here. Dr. Franks arrived at St. John's Seminary in 2009. She was hired as the co-director of the Master of Theological Studies for the New Evangelization degree program, which at that time was really in its planning stages. After much success in implementing and teaching in that program, she took on broader roles at the seminary, teaching across all degree programs. She taught such diverse courses as God 1 and 3 and Faith and Reason, Mariology and Theology of the Body. And she accomplished significant institutional service as a central member of reestablishing the SJS Faculty Scholarship Forum and the SJS Thesis Board, meanwhile directing numerous master's theses. The crafting of the new and comprehensive SJS Thesis Handbook is in no small part due to the efforts of Dr. Franks. Beyond this work at the seminary, Dr. Franks served the Archdiocese of Boston, instructing the faithful in various ways. She authored publications, too manifold to itemize here, and rose to the prominent position of fellow at academic institutes and a peer reviewer for numerous publishing houses and academic journals. Some latest honors and accomplishments are to serve as the vice president and now the president-elect of the Academy of Catholic Theology. Recently, she has been asked to serve as a lay advisor for the doctrinal committee of the USCCB. I'm sure that I can speak for all of us assembled here this evening, Dr. Franks, in saying that we are very grateful for your efforts on the part of the gospel and the seminary. You will be truly missed here next year, and we wish you God's abundant blessings in the years to come. Could we give Dr. Franks a round of applause? This evening, Dr. Franks is offering a lecture based on the major theme of her latest book entitled Body and Identity, A History of the Empty Self. Summarizing an effect of secularity on personal human identity, Dr. Franks recently wrote, "In the effort to create a univocal field of equality, untrammeled from any relation to an enslaving God, secular thinkers yanked up the anchor that rooted the human person in her divinely received identity. Floating adrift on a liquid sea of options, with no structuring good to elevate one over the other, we cling to a sequence of identity islands, often sexual in nature, because it seems to be the easiest way out of our predicament. but none has the finality to re-anchor our shipwrecked sense of self. This evening, Dr. Franks will help us trace an ongoing attempt in the West to shake off received personal identities, often leading to a crisis of self and identity. While at the same time, she will recall the full self-identity and dignity offered to all in Christ Jesus. On a more practical note, I should mention that there'll be a short question and answer immediately following the lecture, so please consider presenting Dr. Franks with your questions. Also, you'll find information sheets on the tables about Dr. Franks' new book and how to obtain that book at a discount. And now, Dr. Franks.
Thank you so much. It's really an honor to be here. I'll do some quick thank yous. I won't do too many. First of all, thank you for all of my former students, especially the lay students who made it here on a very cold night. Thank you to the seminarians who have to be here, but who are pretending that they want to be here very well. So thank you. I'd like to thank our rector, Father Salox, Monsignor Salox, excuse me, I'll never get used to that, I'm sorry, who, I've served under multiple rectors, and Monsignor Salox has really been a joy to serve under, so I'm really grateful. As has the seminary, really, I wasn't gonna cry. If I'm crying, it's like an illusion. It's like, the roof is leaking or something. The seminary has really been a beautiful academic home to me. I tell people a good seminary is the best place to be in the church because it's full of youth and love for the church and love for the truth. So I've really been able to experience that here. So thank you. And just a last thank you. Linda, could you stand up? Sorry, just quickly, just for 2 seconds. This is Linda Sheehan. Okay, she can sit down now. Linda is my former student who, when I was in the throes of wrestling with this book, reached out to me via email and asked, can I just help you with some academic project for free? Like, I would just like to do something. And so Linda has compiled the index and the bibliography to my book. Yes, Rachel understands what a gift this is. And so I'm so grateful. She's been a wonderful help. And don't buy the book because you're getting free copies. So do not, use the coupon code. So thank you very much, Linda. It's really meant a lot to me. Yeah. You're welcome. Okay, so the body and identity. How did we get here? Carl Trueman, in The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, describes how sexuality shifted from something one did to something one was. Sexuality became, in other words, an identity, and perhaps the most important feature of one's identity. The shift from doing to being has to be qualified, however, because the being in question is often more a matter of style than anything deep or intrinsic. So, for example, Catherine D. explains in her 2023 article for Fair Disputations, the article entitled "It's a Vibe, How the Sexual Orientation Lost the Sex," that sexual identification is not the same thing as sexual practice. Indeed, according to the 2023 Pew study on LGBTQ adults, so if we look at the left first, I don't know if you can see this, but it says that 7% identify as L or G or B. Among adults 18 to 29, the percentage is 17%, which seems quite large. But the large majority of these LGB individuals, 62%, identify as B, bisexual. And 84% of the bisexuals, according to the 2013 study on the right, have opposite sex partners, thus skewing the total results. Counterintuitively, 40% of LGB adults have opposite sex partners. What is going on? As Dee argues, as acceptance of minority sexual orientations and gender identity has grown, these categories have become much more nebulous. Rather than being guided by physical experience, one's sexuality and gender identity are now determined by something much harder to define: feelings. The shift is determined in part by technology. She continues, as our lifestyles become more internet-based and therefore disembodied, we see a distinct shift in people choosing identities that interest them or reflect their internal essence, end quote. So any given sexuality might reflect as much the person one wants to be, based on online influencers and other factors, than what the person is actually desiring or doing in real life. How did we get here? It's a long story, and I cannot tell it all today, but feel free to purchase and read my book, Body and Identity. What I will present today is the surprising history beside these trends, history in short form, namely that despite what we might think, our modern identity problems didn't begin yesterday, or a few years ago, or even with the sexual revolution. The history is longer and stranger than we think. In order to explore this more, first we need to understand better what we mean by identity. The most ancient meaning of identity, which I call identity one, is the endurance of a thing through time. So keep in mind, we only use the word identity pretty recently. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what we mean by identity has these three meanings, and the first is this oldest one, endurance through time. So in this sense, I am today identical to my previous self. I can say, I did that when thinking about what I did yesterday, and I can predict that I will continue to be and to act in the future. This baseline meaning is primarily metaphysical, often explained in terms of Aristotelian substance. And the second and third meanings of identity depend on the first. Identity one is the most basic. Identity two is what the Platonists called the true self. As summarized in the answer a person gives to the ancient Delphic oracle's command of gnautheseauton, know thyself. If identity one is the most basic, identity two is the most central. Identity three is a person's knowledge or emotional or conscious awareness of identity two. Identity three is the most accessible. When Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice says, "Till this moment I never knew myself," she is speaking of a belated coming to awareness, or identity three, of who she really was, or identity two. Matters are not so simple for Elizabeth, of course, or for any of us, because what immediately follows her awareness is the question of whether she ought to be the person she now knows, or should she be a better person? Is her current self her true self, or is there another better person she could be? Such questions are the existential heart of identity. Thematizing these three layers of meaning to the one word identity brings precision and clarity to the subject matter. And trust me, people haven't done this before, so it's actually really helpful to just tease out that what we mean by identity has these three meanings. Understood in this way, identity is no longer a modern problem, although loading the one word identity with all three of these meanings is a modern phenomenon, beginning with John Locke, as we will see. The mystery of the human person, however, has captivated the imagination and the minds of thinkers for as long as we have written philosophy. Let us now turn to two fundamental concepts I present in Body and Identity in order to understand how we get to our current situation. And those two concepts are liquid modernity and the body as a totem. Zygmunt Bauman was a Polish sociologist who produced a stream of books around the concept of liquid modernity. Rather than divide up historical epochs into modernity and postmodernity, Bauman argues that modernity was characterized by solid and liquid modernity. Solid modernity privileged size and stability, institutions, comprehensiveness, and clarity. Think encyclopedias. Versailles is a quintessential example of solid modernity. So is Bauman's favorite example, the Ford automobile factory, founded over 200 years later. Solid modernity was interested in conquering space, initiating the age of colonization and rockets to the moon. Liquid modernity, on the other hand, prizes speed, flexibility, and choice. Bauman saw the change happening somewhat definitively by the post-World War II era, and fully reigning by the time he wrote Liquid Modernity in the year 2000. If solid modernity wanted to conquer space, liquid modernity desires to conquer time, more speed and efficiency, longer battery life. Why this liquidity? Why does it appeal to us? Bauman explains that fluids change shape when subjected to stress. They flow out of the way of force. Solids, on the other hand, do not flow. They either maintain their shape or they shatter. But if someone takes a jackhammer to a solid, it twists or breaks. But if you take a jackhammer to a fluid, it flows away. Fluidity is strong because it is flexible. So people choose the liquidity of weak ties rather than strong bonds, of maybes rather than yeses or nos, because it seems stronger. Post-structuralist or postmodern philosophers Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari put it succinctly: flows. Who doesn't desire flows and relationships between flows and breaks and flows? Bauman grants the appeal of liquidity, but mostly bemoans what is lost. In particular, he highlights the impact of all of this on the question of identity. Like those who criticize identity politics, Bauman critiques the reduction of politics to life politics. Along these lines, he quotes a Woody Allen routine on educating the denizens of our narcissistic age. Allen proposed that a course on ethics would have to include, quote, the categorical imperative and 6 ways to make it work for you, end quote. I'm glad you guys laughed, because I once gave that to like a non-philosophically trained audience and they had no idea what I was talking about, yeah. But Bauman also notes perceptively that solid modernity originally problematized identity by making it something to construct rather than to receive. With secularism and the detachment of the meaning of the person from God's creative will, identity became a task, quote, an identity that can only exist as an unfilled project. Given this anxious self-construction, one can see why identity politics are so appealing. They provide roles like suits off the rack. If I don't feel up to the task of sewing an identity from scratch for myself, it's the outsourcing of identity. This happens in Catholic ways as well, of course, on both the left and the right. Bauman writes, quote, there is no assertion but self-assertion, no identity but made-up identity in liquid modernity. I want to underline a few aspects of Bauman's thought. First, the greater freedom of liquid modernity is a freedom of exploding choices, or a freedom of indifference, as Serge Pinckaers puts it, rather than a greater interior liberty. A merely numerical increase in options can lead to paralysis and a greater unfreedom. Further, the question of who I am becomes especially vexed in a liquid age. In solid eras, such as the pre-modern ones, let's take the picture on the left, people certainly asked the question, as instructed by the Delphic Oracle. The answers, however, were generally cosmic and natural. For example, 1,000 years I might identify, not that I would use the word that way, as a Christian, and thus as a creature of the good God, as a member of the family France, and a peasant working in the lands of the Lord of Heidelberg, let's say. What happens when all of these things, religion, the cosmos, status, wealth, family, and tribe, are liquefied? Then you have our world, a world in which numerous other identity strategies are utilized. So then you have stock photo guy on the right, wondering, who am I? Do I have to buy more things to be somebody? Am I cool enough yet? Trying to figure stuff out on my own. One last historical note, and in defense of stock photo guy, let us not forget that the great historical solvent relativizing solids and valorizing liquidity was Christianity. Against the solid categories of race, tribe, status, and even family, Christianity preached that in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Follow me and let the dead bury their dead. Christianity first introduced an individuality normed not primarily by these solid structures, but by the liquidity of one's individual mission in Christ. As with Paul, self-consciously knowing himself to be one set apart from eternity by God, to be, as Acts puts it, God's chosen instrument to carry God's name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. While clearly Christianity cannot endorse the moral relativism and other related features of liquid modernity, it is not simply a solid institution. Let's talk now about the body. How does the body fit into this identity crisis? So simply put, a little too quickly put, the body is a scapegoat, or more precisely, a totem in Freud's sense of the word. So a totem, according to the anthropologists, is an animal or an object that is emblematic of a particular tribe or social unit. The totem is often presented in origin myths as birthing the tribe's original members, and it has a magic ability to protect and guide. And yet, as Freud insisted, the totemic animal was often sacrificed in solemn rites. For the contemporary developed world, the body functions like a totem when it comes to identity. It identifies, it fascinates, it distracts, and it is ultimately sacrificed. The body identifies. As the visible pole in the personal body-soul complex, the body is our shortcut to the much more complex problems of personal identity. If you don't know who you are and you have all of these, you're very unsettled personally, it's much easier to pretend you have a body problem than that you have a psychological or spiritual problem. The body also fascinates in a quasi-religious manner as the cult of wellness replaces any transcendent orientation. In this way, the body distracts us from our seemingly insoluble personal problems. But finally, the body is sacrificed. When we are fed up with its demands and its inability to do the impossible tasks we have given it, we tend to make it the scapegoat that is now the cause, not the solution, of the problem. In other words, we both over and undervalue the body. First, we expect the body to provide us with personal identity and a sense of peace. When it does not live up to our unrealistic expectations, we assume the body's current configuration is the problem. Then we deploy the tools of biopower, such as hormones, surgery, and other medical and pharmacological interventions. The ultimate goal is not merely the manipulation of the body, but the achievement of a sense of identity at any cost. Let's take a distressingly common case: a depressed autistic girl going through puberty. In part because of the over-sexualized culture that surrounds her, she is deeply uncomfortable with the bodily changes that are starting to manifest themselves in pre-puberty. She blames her discomfort not on her depression and inability to integrate her body into her sense of self, in other words, on psychological challenges, but rather on her body itself. Here, the body is fascinating and distracting her away from problems that are difficult to address and towards a problem that is material in nature and technological in solution, namely her sex as female. In taking puberty blockers and setting herself up eventually for surgery, she will sacrifice her body and allow its new form, made possible by technology, to identify her. This example is a case of the presuppositions and tools of biopower scapegoating and mutilating a healthy body for problems that are not in their root bodily. In all of this, however, the body is still not the problem. So one of my arguments in the book is that a lot of our problems that we think are body problems are really identity problems, and gender is like the most obvious example of this. So the crux of the problem is the identity disorder that plagues the West, the crisis of the subject that resists being fixed. So I present a history of the empty self in the book. I'll do a much briefer job of that here, I promise. But I want to start with pre-modern identity. So how did we get here? Not just because of the sexual revolution. Let's go farther back, much farther back, in fact, to the pre-moderns. We have, by the 13th century, a rich and synthetic understanding of the three kinds of identity, as well as significant debate over precisely these topics. The late ancient, the late antique, and medieval voices gave a diversity of perspectives on the self, yet a rich picture emerges of something like a consensus in the Christian West. In unvarying self, identity 1, must underlie change and accidents through time, as self later via Christianity understood ontologically and given the name hypostasis or persona. This self can be identified as true, identity 2, the closer it approaches to the divine, a conviction that had Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, and Augustinian flavors. Within Christianity and against the dominant Platonic paradigm, the true self comes to be more and more equated with the body-soul union and not with one part of the person, such as the intellect. Further, the question of how to know oneself, identity 3, was seriously explored in a variety of contexts. Every commentator on Peter Lombard's sentences had an account of self-knowledge because Lombard did. Lastly, early Christianity buttressed the dual metaphysical contributions of Aristotelian substance as this thing, first substance, and this kind of thing, second substance, by reflecting further on what it meant to be a person as subsisting, knowing, and loving by means of the powers given in a nature. Thus, as the medievalist Alain de Libera notes concerning recent questions on the self and identity, quote, almost all of these questions have been dealt with in the Christological debates, that means the 5th century. Many have been raised in Trinitarian debates, the 4th century. Most theorists and historians of the self, who are generally coming out of philosophy, are innocent of this history. But in fact, the theological controversies drove a huge advance in philosophical precision concerning the self. All of these pre-modern approaches, including the pagan ones, relied almost universally on a conception of human nature and on a cosmology, in which the world is in relation to the divine. These two elements were often thick enough to provide sufficient content to answer the demand of the Delphic oracle, know thyself, and the surrounding solid culture provided the rest. Thus, in this framework, I understand myself to be this kind of being, human, within a tightly hierarchical cosmos, all ordered to God. Christian metaphysical speculations push forward the question of the differentiation of persons from each other. But the particularities of myself, the material content of who I am, in contrast with who other human persons are, these particularities are less worked out. They often center around my qualities and roles, as with the Stoics or as Aristotelian accidents, or on my being as a distinct act of being or subsistence, as with Thomas. Although St. Paul and Augustine emphasized rather the person individually created and called by God. In Christianity, especially in Augustine, these concerns were closely tied to theology. But as John Rist notes, quote, generally as the Middle Ages wore on, questions of theology, especially of salvation, tended to become separated from questions of philosophical psychology, hence of ethics and broader philosophical reflections. So the worth to be attributed to persons, deriving above all from theological claims, as Augustine so well understood, tend to be taken for granted as interest focused more immediately on philosophical disputes, end quote. Thus, as the early theological debate on person and nature moved into the past, the ground was prepared for a solely philosophical approach to identity that emerges in early modernity. Let me be even more clear, as I've already alluded to. A dissolving element lurks within Christianity itself that would serve to destabilize the medieval consensus concerning identity. A consensus that, practically speaking, filled out the particularities of identity with group membership, class, family, and so forth. As Christianity relativizes the realities of family, work, and tribe, it makes them of penultimate importance only. The primacy belongs to God's call, a call that lifts Saul out of his ethnic and religious setting, or lifts Thomas Aquinas out of his family and its aristocratic career path, and bestows new identities on them. In this way, there is no Jew or Greek before the Christian God because of a new democracy of salvation open to all. The penultimate structures of family and tribe are good, of course, but they're not ultimately determinative of a life. This relativization begins to liquefy the cultural solids and transforms the identity question. When secularism becomes ascendant, as I'll talk about, and the centrality of God's call disappears, what remains is the sense that identity cannot be found in institutions, but without any content to replace the Christian content that was lost. Further, Christianity makes the content of one's identity a matter of discernment, not just the knowledge of universal truths that are the same for all. These universal truths are still necessary to know, of course, but they do not get us to a properly Christian answer to the Delphic oracle. Paul is called from eternity to be this chosen instrument to the Gentiles, a truth that cannot be known through intellectual abstraction, but through experience. Stoicism had begun to explore this realm, but its approach remained closely tied to its cosmology. With Christianity, it becomes insufficient to say that my true self is found in a return to what is most intellectual and closest to the divine. But what will be sufficient had not yet been satisfactorily theorized, although the germ of the answer is found in Paul and Augustine. When we arrive at the end of the High Medieval period, what we get, therefore, is a developed metaphysical and epistemological account of the person, along with a residual, mostly unspoken skepticism concerning the old solid ways of filling out the person with content. This skepticism Christianity will bequeath to modernity, which will develop formal personal structures in its own anti-metaphysical way, while carrying the skepticism to an agnostic and ultimately secularizing pitch. By the time we get to Kant, the self is a formal activity that has no material content. I won't talk about Kant tonight, but I do have a chapter in my book if you just really want to go to Kant. All right, so early modernity, let's look at John Locke. In his journal in 1962, Locke wrote, quote, on this slide, identity of persons lies not in having the same numerical body, made up of the same particles, nor if the mind consists of incorporeal spirits in their being the same. So if identity is not found in the body or in those strange incorporeal spirits, where is it? He continues, quote, but identity is found in the memory of one's past self and actions, continued on under the consciousness of being the same person, whereby every man owns himself, end quote. This draft captures all the important aspects of his later account of identity in the 1694 edition of an essay concerning human understanding. This journal entry has been called by Alain de Libera the, quote, baptismal certificate of the modern subject that radicalizes Descartes' separation of the body from human thought. But Locke is, in fact, much more interested in consciousness than is Descartes. According to Locke, distinct from any physical man is a conscious person, or self, who has continuity, or not, depending solely upon his memory of his own consciousness. Locke is the first to use the term identity not only to mean the logical, numerical, or material identity of a thing, or identity one. For Locke, in fact, identity through time means consciousness, sustained as a sequence of points over time as the memory one has of oneself. Thus, he folds identity one into identity three, and he has to do this because he rejects Aristotelian substance rather famously. Unlike Augustinian memory, which participates in the mysterious and quasi-divine nature of the present moment that enfolds past and future, Lockean memory is simply the extent of the reach of consciousness into the past, while the Lockean future is the comparison of our consciousness of present pleasure and pain to possible future pleasure and pain. These proposals show that Lockean personhood may reside in, but need not be identical to the body, in a radicalized version of the Platonic pilot in his ship. Further and quintessentially modern is the upending of identity, both identity one and identity two, from existence to consciousness, rooted in our reflective powers. The radical conclusion is that, quote, Socrates asleep and Socrates awake is not the same person, end quote. Why? Because they do not share the same consciousness. As a result, however, identity becomes punctual, to use Charles Taylor's language. The self is a point, not a continuum, but a power of consciousness which provides continuity over time only as far as consciousness itself reaches. Locke thereby, however, bakes a contradiction into his thesis on personal identity, in which the continuity of consciousness is both necessary and impossible. No one is continuously conscious, not even Socrates. Given the difficulties of his valorization of conscience, why make it at all? In fact, Locke needs to make this move from being to consciousness because the metaphysical reality of Aristotelian substance has been downgraded. And I can speak more to this during the Q&A, but basically Locke takes power and replaces substance with power. And so the things that were considered to be related to substance become powers for Locke. All right, so consciousness now has to do double duty. The constructive work that consciousness does in constructing identity harmonizes with Locke's political theory, in particular his understanding of property. Politics, like substance and identity, only follows upon man's constructive activity. So Remy Bragg observes of Locke's theory, quote, "Before being a political animal, man is the animal who works," end quote. This stance is completely consistent. As one's conscious construction forms one's own identity, and the lack of such construction forms identity loss, so too does one's work create one's own property, and its absence means a lack of property. I am the one who owns myself because I constructed myself through my acts of consciousness. While Locke would surely shrink from the extremes of contemporary liquid social constructionist anthropologies, he nevertheless proposed one of the first ones. So Locke is an important move here, and then the broader trend that really kind of creates modern identity is secularism. Charles Taylor traces the rise of secular exclusive humanism as, quote, "a purely self-sufficient humanism, accepting no final goals beyond human flourishing, nor any allegiance to anything else beside this flourishing," end quote. The rise of this ontological immanence leads me to the main point I want to emphasize in this section on secularization, that secularity is best described as a 90-degree rotation of the transcendent, subsuming it within an immanent ontological and imaginary frame. Now the immanent and not the divine is presupposed to contain both our origin and our goal. As John Paul II says, quote, "In our heavily secularized world, a gradual secularization of salvation has taken place, so that people strive for the good of man, but man who is truncated, reduced to his merely horizontal dimension." Such secular immanentizing is necessarily post-Christian. Why? Because a clear distinction between the immanent and the transcendent was required before one could be chosen in preference to the other, and it is only with Judeo-Christianity that such a clear distinction was provided. The theoretical reason for this distinction is rooted in the creation accounts in Genesis. As Robert Sokolowski explains, Judeo-Christianity created a new understanding of God and hence a new discourse of divine transcendence. For Greek and Roman pagan myth and thought, the divine was simply the best and highest within the being of the world. But for Judeo-Christianity, the divine is outside of the being of this world. This new Judeo-Christian conviction emphasized that the world did not have to be at all, and yet God would still be, and he would be without any diminution of his being. This Christian distinction between God and the world is unprecedented in paganism. Indeed, Sokolowski rebuts the Heideggerian idea that always and everywhere men have wondered why there is something rather than nothing. In fact, the question arises out of specifically Judeo-Christian wonder. Yet once the distinction has been made between God and the world, the danger is that the world will be conceived as self-enclosed and no longer operating by the kind of divine natural necessity so obvious in the pagan myths. The possibility of secularity required the clear distinction between God and the world if the world is to stand on its own. In other words, Judeo-Christianity's bright line between the one God and his manifold creatures, which is so clear in Athanasius and in the anti-Arian writings of the Church Fathers, this bright line, now I lost my place, only once the world was seen as having the relative autonomy vis-a-vis the divine could this autonomy be detached from God and be made absolute. I'm not arguing that Judeo-Christianity was a sufficient cause for secularity. I'm not saying secularity was inevitable from Christianity. But my point is rather that secularism's immanentizing move, once it was made, was and is in conscious opposition to the transcendent God of Judeo-Christianity. This is why secularity is a post-Christian reality that thrives most luxuriantly in post-Christian cultures. Globalization and the hegemony of secular Western academic and entertainment elites can and do export secularity to other cultures with varying degrees of success, but secularity's homeland is in traditional Judeo-Christian societies. In the imaginary of secularity, phenomena that were once ascribed to God's causality now need to be explained on their own terms. Secularity dogmatically cuts off the vertical element of creation's relation to God, or, as I have said, this relation is turned 90 degrees and subsumed under immanence. This 90-degree turn means that identity cannot be received from God, but now must be self-created. So that's the ultimate impact that this has on identity, that we are told that we have to, the only material to create our identity is found purely immanently, that we're not supposed to look for a transcendent God. So we have social structures liquefied in some ways because it's true, they're not of ultimate value, but there's now no content to replace what they provided once the content provided by Christianity has also been evacuated. All right, so that's all depressing. Let's make some theological progress. And honestly, this is mostly a preview of the follow-up book to this book, and so this is not completely, I can't actually remember how much of this is in the book that I just finished, but a lot of this I'm going to develop more in a follow-up book. What then can we say about identity against this background? What can we say in relation to the Judeo-Christian reality? While Judeo-Christianity places God beyond the world in his transcendence, it simultaneously, especially in Christianity, brings him very near to us, and the two features depend upon one another. God is so transcendent, so beyond this world, that he can be deeply within the world without any compromise to his being. He can be everywhere precisely because he is nowhere. Yet the intimacy of God with man is also why man's identity is not something to be made by the self, ex nihilo, but why it is instead something to be received without. And in this process, I want to argue that identity two, or the true self, is really the crux of the matter. Mere continuity, or identity one, is necessary but not sufficient to know thyself. And my self-consciousness of who I am, identity three, is dependent upon there being an I that is knowable. Yet it is precisely identity two that ends up problematized by the history that I've traced here. We have abandoned both meanings of Aristotelian substance, both the metaphysical anchor of my being, identity one, and my human nature, which is part of the answer to identity two. If I don't know I'm human, I certainly can't know any more about what it means to be myself. We have replaced these with my conscious or emotional circling around this empty center. Thus, I call the contemporary self empty, meaning that modern men and women are inclined in a way historically unique to disbelieve in any content to, and often in the very reality of identity too. And if you're familiar with postmodernism, there's the whole big thing about the death of the subject that is really part of this. This identity to agnosticism may go hand in hand with a rejection of identity one, as with Locke. It may also entail a rejection of identity three, or of our understanding, although more common is an inclination to privilege identity three. So concretely, this privileging means the primacy of what I think or feel about myself and how I present myself over and above any actual reality of myself. So we have somebody who's not a subject, who's thinking about something that's not an object, and that's somehow the identity that we're supposed to have. So is it any wonder that people are confused, right? Authenticity language can confuse the issue because authenticity sounds a lot like my true self. However, authenticity has been relocated from the concrete reality of a given person to the thoughts or feelings one has about oneself, and we're back at identity 3. We saw this with Locke, and Rousseau also greatly develops this. And we saw it also in the beginning, right, with the sexual identities, where the sexual identity is more important than one's actual sexual activity. When identity 2 does have concrete content, it is usually found outside of oneself in group membership. Hence the importance of contemporary identity politics, which provide content that can, however, be easily discarded. Yesterday, someone identified as a lesbian, but tomorrow she or he need not, and at no time does she or he need to have lesbian sex. This transferal of identity 2 to identity 3 can help explain why moderns can be convinced of something internally contradictory, namely that their authentic selves are something to be constructed rather than accepted or received. This contradiction is embedded within trans discourse, for example, where born this way narratives jostle with those of gender fluidity and gender construction. Is my gender fluid or was I born this way? Which is it, right? Every time I do side things, I lose where I was. Accounts of self-construction combined with authenticity language result in the displacement of the true self from identity 2 to identity 3, or the thoughts and feelings I have about myself. So let's go to a more positive note. If we conceive of identity not as a project, but as a received task, then what becomes most important is discerning not what I want or desire or feel, much less plunging into activity. What is most important is discerning what the source of my identity has in mind for me. In a theistic transcendent approach, this means discerning the plan of God. Of course, this plan might be revealed by means of my feelings, preferences, and strengths, but it will also stretch me in unanticipated ways, so this plan cannot simply be read off of my preferences. For example, I was certainly never going to have 6 kids. What? Judeo-Christianity is, in fact, the great defender of particularity. Only here does God call a particular people to a particular land to be and live out particular promises. Only here does the fulfillment of those promises take the form of a particular man born at a particular time. Christianity is the last and only great defender of personal identity in its fullness. Her dogmas have embedded the metaphysics necessary for identity 1, certainly, and Christian reflections upon topics such as discernment of spirits have advanced thought concerning identity 3. More significantly, however, it is only within Christianity that the 90-degree turn of secularity is overcome, while still maintaining that God-world distinction that modernity rightly senses is necessary if I am to be myself. In Christianity, in which the Father is other than the Son and the Spirit, I am given ontological permission to be other than God. I am commanded, in fact, to have a distinctive identity. It is truly my identity, however, only if it is not from me at all, just as I truly exist by coming from another. This Christian secret of the goodness of particularity ought to be shared with the world, and this writing project is an attempt to do that. So thank you very much for your attention. So we can do Q&A. A reminder again that if you're interested in the book, you can get a discount. I apologize for the expense.
So ladies and gentlemen, we have one mic to use tonight, so I'll try to run, get a question, or if you're so inclined, if you don't mind coming up to me, you can pose the question to Dr. Franks. So want to raise your hand, and I'll do my best to get there really quickly, but understand that I run to you, and then I have to run back here. So, would like to begin?
Yeah, of course, it's Tim in the back, yeah. You're young and healthy.
Excellent talk, Dr. Franks.
Thank you, Tim.
You mentioned Gutierrez and I believe it was Deleuze.
Yeah, Deleuze.
I know, like, one of the things they bring up about is this concept of, like, desiring machines in the book, The Anti-Oedipus.
Indeed.
And, like, one of those kind of concepts is that there is this sort of breakage from individuality as a result of sort of categorization. And it seems like that's like a big goal of the gender movement, like at least philosophically, is this sort of abolition of categorization. I don't know, what would be your answer to that?
Great. I had no idea one of my seminarians was so conversant with Deleuze. I've actually written like quite a bit on Deleuze, who I think is the most interesting postmodern because he's the most thoroughly, consistently wrong. Like he's wrong in all of the ways you can be wrong, not just a couple ways. But yeah, you're exactly right. Like very much this fractured self, which is often held up in postmodernity, is considered a goal. It's considered like liberation that. You know, we're held back by categories and things that try to kind of keep us rooted in one place. And so instead we're supposed to like spread in these lines of flight and escape from all of that. The real problem with that is that what they're describing is actually like a real breakdown of the human person. It's a pathology. It's like, you know, pathological narcissism is one of the results of that. And I do think that the gender movement really flirts with that sort of thing because it's like, you know, you're imprisoning me with your categories, and so I'll experience freedom if I somehow can fight back against those categories. And yeah, it's definitely has a real liquefying tendency. Yeah, and so, you know, the freedom that Christianity brings is not a freedom from our nature, but a freedom to be at home within our nature and what God has called us to be. And so that's really what, you know, we pray and hope for people who are struggling with their gender, that they can achieve it through accepting their body. I'm fine with that, yeah. I can speak loudly too.
I was very interested in Locke and the identification between the conscious and subconscious. You identified two actual separate entities. Could you expound a little bit more on that? Very interesting.
With consciousness and subconsciousness? Yeah, so I didn't really talk too much about subconsciousness, but Locke is, I mean, so a lot of people think Descartes is the one who really engineered. Can you guys hear me in the back well enough? Okay, awesome, thank you guys. Descartes emphasized, you know, the dualism between oneself and one's body, but he actually didn't really have much to say about consciousness. It's really Locke who elevates consciousness to such an important part of our identity, and it's something that's reflected in a lot of places, but you see it, for example, among neuroscientists who are like, well, you know, our brain, it creates this memories and somehow we're conscious, but we're not really sure, but it must be the brain. And that's all that we are, right? Like our identity is just a matter of creating a narrative that we like, pretty much. So it's very relativistic. And Locke wasn't necessarily trying to be explicitly relativistic like that, but he does just relocate identity solely in what we're thinking or feeling, and not believing that we have to be thinking or feeling about something. And so that's why I keep emphasizing the importance of the true self.
Thank you, Dr.
Thank you. Rachel.
I guess I'll just yell. I was really interested, I mean, this distinction that Bauman has between solid modernity and liquid modernity, I mean, it's obviously interesting in many different ways, but two things that I would love to hear your thoughts on. But number one, Christianity also gets blamed for solid modernity.
Yeah.
A lot of times, right? Precisely because of the God-world distinction, right? So, you know, being able to like control space and time only comes when, you know, you don't have the kind of animistic understanding of the cosmos, right? The gods aren't within, and therefore it evacuates the supernatural, and then we can kind of lay down measurements, right? And so it's interesting to me that you have Christianity kind of at fault for both solid modernity and liquid modernity. In addition to the fact that, I mean, they seem to be opposed to each other on some level, right? Solid modernity and liquid modernity. And I think this is, you know, the gender movement, I think rightly also, gender ideology rightly gets accused of being totally inconsistent at times, which you pointed to, right? Like, is it your true self or is it, you know, like your gender fluidity, et cetera, right? But it does seem too that liquid modernity depends on solid modernity, and especially when it comes to the gender ideology, precisely because the technology that results from solid modernity only makes the you know, manipulation of the body that liquid modernity once desires possible. So I was just wondering if you could maybe comment. I just love to hear more about like how the two relate. Maybe especially with regard to gender, but and how Christianity is seemingly at fault for both.
Oh, cool. It's working. Okay, awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. And I'm emphasizing the liquid aspects of Christianity, but Christianity obviously has a lot of solid aspects as well, right? I mean, especially the Catholicism, we have hierarchy and canon law and, you know, things that you run up against, right? And so I'm not trying to say that it's purely liquid at all, but it is, I think, viewed like, when actually the way that I bumped up into Bauman's writings was reading something by Angelo Scola, who was using Bauman to talk about how the family and the Catholic Church are kind of like the last really solid realities that people want to try to liquefy. And so it's not surprising that if, you know, you're trying to liquefy everything, you're going to especially aim at the family and at the church. And I think that that's absolutely a correct assessment of the situation, because the church has continuity that indicates its solidity. I just think it's improper to see Christianity just simply on the side of kind of solidity, that like it looks at kind of our current situation and is just simply like, well, we just have to become more solid, because that's actually, you know, that I presented on this once, and there was a priest who had been a missionary in China. And he came up to me afterwards and he said, so I was talking about kind of how Christianity is an identity liquefier in some ways. And he said, what you are describing is exactly what the communist authorities are terrified of in Christianity, and what kind of the people on the ground, how people on the ground view Christianity, that it no longer makes the state and the family and these other things of primary importance. So it's obviously a complicated story, what Christianity is doing, and I don't want to try to oversimplify it. The liquid solid kind of relationship through time, like just talking about modernity, Bauman is a little bit simplistic because he does imply, though he elsewhere says it's not the case, but he implies pretty strongly that it's just a simple temporal succession. First you had solid, then you have liquid, and liquid just kind of replaces solid. But I mean, you don't have to read much of Locke before you see that he was very interested in liquefying things. But solid modernity, in many ways, as other people have observed, you know, it rides on the coattails of Christianity. So it's like, it's trying to create a kind of systematic structural replacement of Christianity in many ways, so that you don't need Christianity for people to be moral, ethical people, and for, you know, business to flourish and so forth. And so it's going to kind of squeeze out Christianity, but it's also riding on the coattails of, you know, Christianity's understanding of the dignity of the human person and equality and the natural law and so forth. So it gets away with this for a few centuries, basically. And I think what happens in the 20th century is that this kind of long destabilization of identity just finally, like the house of cards just finally collapses. It just took several centuries of modernity for the Christian hangover to be lost. And now people are just genuinely post-Christian and really confused. And that's what we have all around us. But it didn't just start. So I don't know if I didn't fully answer your question, but thank you for that. That was really helpful. I think Monsignor Fay had a hand up. I don't know if he's still.
Thank you, Dr. Franks. I want to say, first of all, for all the theology of the body students in the classroom, on behalf of them all, thank you for still making use of the triptych, the 3 identities. That's awesome. The second thing is, you mentioned later in the talk that like identity is kind of a task that God gives to each individual to discover the self that God gives each. And in theology of the body, as we learned in class, John Paul II thinks of the body itself as a task. Do you think there's some talking points, or have you thought of talking points between those who understand the body as a task and those who might think of it as like, what was the word that you used? The Freudian sort of...
The totem.
What was the word?
Totem?
Totem, yeah, like a Freudian totem. Like, what would be, what would be some talking points for those people?
Very nice. Thank you. I'm kind of in terror that one of the propedeutic men is going to come up because I tortured them with presentations last semester. And I'm really worried that one of these questions is going to be like my grading rubric. Yeah. So I'm glad it was just about theology of the body. I actually wrote an article. Oh no, now I've given them ideas. I wrote an article on putting John Paul II's understanding of the body and sexuality as a task in conversation with Judith Butler, who's kind of the original kind of giving gender fluidity its philosophical basis. And I do think actually he really is on to something that's just really a really human experience if we reflect long enough about it, that we find it a challenge to be embodied spirits, and we find it a challenge to be sexed as male or female embodied spirits. And after the fall, like for Adam and Eve, it's not a task, it's just a natural reality that they do really easily and in a state of grace. But for us, after the fall, all of these things that are natural to us really now become tasks. And so we can't just naturally become a Christian woman or a Christian man. Like, it doesn't just happen sort of organically and naturally. It requires a lot of grace, and it requires a lot of active harmonizing of all of these different elements of ourself. And so I think that's what he's getting at with that language of task. And I think that when people like Judith Butler or others, gender confused people are talking about like that they're being sexed as male or female, seems like it should be some kind of activity. Like, I think that's the kernel of truth that they're grasping. So I do think that is something that I've thought about. And I think that is an important thing that we can offer people, that there's a way in which your sexed nature is a project if it's done in harmony with God, because you're not just gonna wake up and be like, oh, I'm a perfectly integrated Christian woman. Like, that's just not, that's what it was like in the garden, but that's not what it's like for us now. Monsignor Fay right here.
Well, thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering, because throughout the talk, there was a lot of this notion of received identity. And so I was wondering, to the degree that personhood and identity, even of the individual, is something that's received and maybe even revealed, especially as it sort of ties into sort of our understanding of the Trinity and the three persons. To what degree would you say that our knowledge of who we are is something that is revealed to us by faith? And then would you say that the crisis of faith is sort of a two-parter, but that the crisis of faith, as it's been described by both Ratzinger and Cardinal Sarah and others, is tied to this crisis of identity as well? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. The moving of the mic gives me a chance to gather my thoughts. Thank you. That's a really interesting question, brother. I would say that, so in Revelation proper, there certainly is identity relevant content that's given to us. So in scripture and in tradition, right, we do learn things that are either inaccessible or hard to access through reason. So the inaccessible stuff would, of course, be that God has a plan for me to be his adopted child, right, which we can't access directly through reason. But the hard to access things would also, even just pertain to our dignity as human beings. That was, in fact, hard and basically not accessed, but in a cultural wide sense outside of Christianity. But more specific, those kind of concern the universal truths about all human beings, which again that's necessary to know to understand who am I, who are you, but it's not going to fully answer the question. It doesn't get to the particularity, and that's where I think if you use Revelation in a more analogous sense, right, that certainly this is something that God has to tell us, and he sometimes tells us these, in prayer or through our close personal relationships, or just as the events of our life unfold, that we kind of get this is what discernment of spirits is in part about, like in what direction am I being led and what's truly authentic in like the Christian sense of the word. I do think that the crisis of faith and the crisis of identity are really deeply related. And so that's why I spend so much time on secularism, because you really lose something essential when you lose the plausibility of Christianity. You lose, or really of any transcendent sense of God. You lose a sense that you are being providentially cared for, not only as like, an anonymous member of humanity, but as the individual that you are. And all of a sudden, everything becomes so much work when who am I? Like, I just have to create this person myself, right? And if I am totally responsible for my self-creation, that also means I'm totally responsible for when it goes wrong. So when, if I'm miserable, then actually that comes back to me, right? There's some truth that's true in Christianity as well, but you don't have any place to rest in the and that's why identity politics are so appealing, because it's like, let me just go on the internet and find a very noisy person who will tell me how I should dress and what I should do and how I should talk. And, you just assimilate as much as you can to something like that. So I think the loss of faith definitely impacts identity, and that's had a huge ripple effect. But I also think it works the other way. If somebody is a really kind of truly empty, there's not much there at their core, which is again what narcissism is like. And I think people you don't have to be a pathological narcissist to still kind of be affected by that kind of narcissism. It's just really hard. How do you know and love someone when you're barely a someone yourself, right? And so that's, I think it definitely has a reverse effect where it's harder to reach people. But I think, it's really good news for us to talk about what Christianity says about identity, and that God does have a plan for you and that he loves you as an individual. It seems like that could be really good news to bring to youth groups and young adult groups and that sort of thing, because whether they know it or not, they are struggling with these identity questions.
In a rise in that kind of question? questioning and actually doing something about it? Like when these
Yeah.
kids decide to actually transition at a young age, and their
Yeah.
parents are like allowing this?
Yeah, I haven't like looked closely at the kind of sociological studies that would examine that. It's also actually hard to find some of that evidence because it's so politicized that people just want the answer to be, well, they just naturally are the opposite sex, of course, and there can't be like we can't look at any other possible contributing factors. So a story that occurred to me when you were talking, Abigail Favali, who does really great work on gender sexuality from a Catholic perspective, she tells a story. When she was living in Oregon, I think a local evangelical church reached out to her, and they said, our youth group, the members of our youth group are really, often struggling with gender stuff. And so they wanted to meet with her. She said, of course. And so they met, and she said, so how many people I think it was a middle school youth group, how many people in your middle school youth group are identifying as trans? And they said, all of them. And so, when that happens, you know that you're not dealing with, isolated, sort of troubled individuals. So there are certain predictors for people who identify as trans, and autism is a really strong one. But my understanding is that family structure is as well, and sometimes income level as well is one that I've heard mentioned. But in general, they're often people, especially girls, who have multiple possible psychological, social issues that should be looked at, and generally are not looked at once they get, pulled into kind of this one-way street. But when you're talking about everybody in the evangelical middle school youth group, now you're not just talking about a particularly troubled population, you're talking about something that's a meme, and that is an identity formative meme, And so this is often called rapid onset gender dysphoria, which psychologists have attempted to study, except it basically got shut down because it was in violation of the Born This Way narrative. But there's a lot of evidence that adolescents, it's like kind of the social contagion that you see sometimes with eating disorders. One girl becomes anorexic and then multiple girls do, or one kid commits suicide and then multiple kids attempt it. It's a similar kind of phenomenon. And so that's why I think it's really helpful to realize the identity issue that's going on, because that's probably the commonality, that they're teenagers trying to figure out who the heck they are, as teenagers tend to do. But the thing is, if you don't want to be basic, if you want to be cool or whatever, you're going to be probably on the rainbow, right? That's where people are being shunted. So, yeah, I hope that helps a little. Yeah, thank you.
Any more questions? Oh, we do have one.
As you mentioned.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to tie that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. In talking about the body as a totem, that's kind of what I was trying to get at, that it's like if I have a social or emotional or psychological challenge, it feels very easy to say the problem is my body, and we can get away with this in part because we now have technology that we think can actually change us into the other sex. Now, it doesn't actually change us, and in fact, it's basically very complicated plastic surgery that very frequently goes awry. I mean, that's basically what it is. But the idea that my body can somehow be the quick solution to my identity crises, even if quick means you're on, cross-sex hormones your entire life and you do all of these difficult surgeries and stuff. It's, there's one person who was actually a really early transitioner, male to female, and then desisted, detransed. And when he talks with people who are, struggling with this, one of the questions he asks them is, when did you first feel uncomfortable with your body? And that usually kind of leads people to kind of unearth the deeper problems that are there, which often have to do with family dynamics and sometimes sexual abuse and lots of other things that are just being glossed over, right? In this kind of obsession with changing the body, because it's a lot more painful to look at past sexual abuse than it is ultimately even to do very painful, physically painful surgeries and so forth. So yeah, thank you.
Well, this brings our lecture to a close this evening. Thank you, Dr. Franks, for such an engaging lecture.